Hello, everyone, and welcome to another complimentary Green Tech Media webinar. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars we do throughout the year to help keep professionals in the solar, energy storage, and grid modernization markets stay informed through research and analysis on the latest technologies and market trends. Today's presentation is Revealing the True Commercial Solar Addressable Market, and it is brought to you by Station A. I'm Ravi Manghani, Global Head of Solar Research at Mackenzie Power and Renewables, and I will be moderating today's webinar. If you enjoy our presentations, I'd like to remind you that GTM events are going virtual in 2020. We are offering today's webinar attendees a special discount to Green Tech Media's upcoming virtual events, including the Solar Summit taking place October 26th to 29th. Don't miss an opportunity to take a deeper dive into the industry with key decision makers, industry professionals, and GTM or WoodMac research analysts. Use code WEBINAR for a 15% discount to these events. Before we get started in the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to go over the screen in front of you. Speaker bios are accessible from the top tabs by clicking on each speaker's name. You can use the link on the left-hand side of your screen to download a copy of the slides from today's webinar. Most importantly, please note the Q&A module on the left side of your screen. At any time during today's presentation, you can submit your questions for your speakers. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the presentation. Again, to remind you, you can submit your questions during any time during the presentation, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Today, you'll be hearing from Kevin Berkmeyer, who's the CEO of Station A, and Michelle Davis, Senior Analyst, U.S. Solar at Mackenzie Power and Renewables. Before I hand over the presentation to Michelle, I want to point out that this is the first time that Mackenzie is looking at this whole question of the total addressable market for commercial solar at an extremely granular level, utilizing our own solar project installation data sets that we have been collecting for a decade now, and utilizing Station A's precise data sets on building footprints. We are very excited to share our early results with you on today's webinar. With that, Michelle, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ravi, and welcome, everyone. It's really awesome to be here, and thanks so much for joining us today. So I'm imagining that many of you in the audience are at least somewhat familiar with the commercial solar industry in the United States. But even if you aren't, it doesn't take long to realize how diverse this segment is. It can include everything from a 100 kilowatt carport at a school to a 5 megawatt community solar project on a farm. And at the same time, high quality data on commercial buildings and commercial businesses can be hard to come by. So these two things combined has meant that, sort of up until now, a really robust assessment of the penetration and the total addressable market for commercial solar has been somewhat nebulous. So if you're anything like me, basically you've been sort of relying on your best rough estimates. And like Ravi was saying, this is sort of the first time that we've been able to do this level of analysis because of this collaboration with Station A, which is really exciting. We combined our own solar project data with the Station A building level data to get a real good bottoms-up view, which I'm excited to present. So before we really dig in, I want to take a couple of minutes to define the scope of this research. So first off, this study covers commercial buildings that have at least 10,000 square feet of roof space. The Station A platform includes building level data for the vast majority of commercial buildings of this size. And we've estimated that this building size equates to roughly about a 70 kilowatt solar project size, which we then used to scope our own solar project data. Second, we made some adjustments to what we considered on-site solar, basically in order to account for any projects that we knew were located on customer sites, but that didn't necessarily serve customer load. So some examples of this might be like an on-site qualifying facility in like the Massachusetts SMART program, or an on-site remotely net metered project in a state like New York. Since those projects occupy customer sites, we definitely wanted to include them in our calculation of on-site solar penetration, even though they don't necessarily serve customers in that exact building. So when we take those two first bullets into account, this study covers 87% of on-site commercial solar capacity and 31% of the number of on-site projects. And then finally, an important note is that we assume that a typical customer of an off-site project, which would be like a community solar project or an off-site remotely net metered project, would draw about 200 kilowatts of demand. And this is just based on the average commercial solar size in the United States, which has been roughly 200 kilowatts for the last several years. So we needed to make this assumption in order to estimate the number of customers that are served from those projects. And then again, we wouldn't have been able to do this analysis without this awesome collaboration with Station A. I also want to emphasize that the study is inherently conservative, which means that there is substantial upside to the commercial solar addressable market that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And here's the reasoning for that. First, we're assuming that 50% of the roof space of a commercial building can be utilized for solar. Now, there's obviously a high amount of variability across commercial rooftops, but many sites can probably use slightly more than 50% of their total roof space. So this is sort of a conservative assumption in that regard. Second, we assume a power density of 14 watts a square foot for those commercial buildings. For today's higher end modules, those tend to achieve power densities closer to 18 watts a square foot. But we didn't want to necessarily assume that commercial customers are always going to opt for high-end modules. But of course, as these modules become cheaper and they become more standard in the marketplace, that just means that there's some upside potential to our study results. And then next, we assessed the economic viability of commercial solar based on a savings rate of 10%. So this rough benchmark is considered sort of the industry standard for attracting a commercial customer. However, there's always going to be some commercial customers out there that are just as enticed by the sustainability or the ESG value of an on-site solar system, which means they might be more apt to accept a lower savings threshold. And then finally, as I noted earlier, the study doesn't consider the potential of projects under 70 kilowatts. However, I do believe that the potential of this specific market segment is a little bit more limited. Because of the issues related to scale, commercial solar developers don't tend to consider projects under 100 kilowatts unless they're part of a larger portfolio of commercial sites. But again, this only really provides upside to the results that we're going to present to you guys today. All right, so with no further ado, let's walk through the results. So first, let's look at the nation as a whole. 3.5% of commercial buildings have on-site solar. While this certainly isn't a massive number by any means, it's a little bit more than what some past studies have estimated, where the typical reported commercial solar penetration is in the range of like 1 to 2%. On top of this, we have demand met from off-site projects. This, of course, includes community solar subscriptions and remotely net metered projects. which accounts for an additional 1.1% of commercial buildings. Now, of the remaining building stock, we know that not all of the buildings will be economically viable sites for solar. So these less viable sites, the ones that don't achieve that 10% savings threshold, accounts for about 25% of commercial buildings. So what we're left with is that the remaining total addressable market is made up of about 600,000 buildings and 145 gigawatts of on-site commercial solar potential. Now, I've obviously been presenting these results so far in terms of the number of commercial buildings, but we can also look at those results in terms of capacity. When we do that, the results look very similar. The biggest change is the on-site solar penetration figure, which represented by that gold bar at the very top. And this increases from 3.5% of buildings to over 5% of the solar potential of those buildings. And this makes sense when you consider the fact that the best commercial solar sites are going to be those that are a bit on the larger side. And thus, they've been sort of the first targets for developers. So what these results ultimately show us is that the sort of quote-unquote untapped potential of distributed commercial solar is roughly 70% of commercial buildings. So the next time that you're looking out an airplane window, which hopefully you're doing under very safe circumstances, you can think about the fact that 70% of those commercial rooftops are viable sites for solar. So now let's drill into some more state-specific results. So this map shows the penetration of commercial solar in terms of both on-site and off-site solar capacity. And unsurprisingly, there is considerable variability across states when it comes to penetration of commercial solar. And I say that this is unsurprising because 80% of all commercial solar capacity has been installed in only 5 states. So it stands to reason that some markets are relatively penetrated while others are not. So when we look at those top markets, which are California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Minnesota, all of those states have over 10% of their capacity potential already tapped. There are a few other states that are also in that bucket, like Vermont, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. But all other US states sit at less than 10% penetration, with most of them being under 5% penetrated. But of course, penetration isn't necessarily the whole story. What we really want to know is which states have the largest addressable markets. So when we view our results in this way, the biggest markets are a mix of legacy markets and emerging markets. What you might normally expect is for the legacy states to have relatively small remaining potential because they've had a lot of commercial solar installed. And this certainly does happen in some states. New Jersey, Connecticut, and Colorado have all been in the top 10 in terms of installed cumulative solar capacity for the commercial segment, but they have fallen out of this list of the top 10 addressable markets. But this doesn't necessarily happen to all of the legacy states. California, New York, and Massachusetts have some of the largest addressable markets, despite the fact that they're over 10% tapped. These are basically states where you have the potent combination of high electricity costs and a lot of commercial rooftops. And then the remaining markets in this chart are basically those where distributed solar economics are increasingly able to offer customer savings. In the case of Texas and Florida in particular, these two states have the third and fourth most commercial buildings in the US. So they just have very large untapped markets. So how does this market potential compare to our outlook? Well, over the next 5 years, our team is forecasting about 12 gigawatts of commercial solar capacity is going to be built. 2020, of course, is going to be a challenging year due to the pandemic, but then starting next year, the market is expected to install about 2 gigawatts a year over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. And this is on top of 13 gigawatts that has already been installed through the end of 2019. So when you compare that to this market potential, even this relatively conservative quantification of the total addressable market is more than 10 times the forecasted build over the next 5 years. Our outlook is effectively accounting for another 8% of this market being tapped within that time frame. And then just for the sake of another comparison, our teams here at WoodMac are forecasting 160 gigawatts of total wind and solar installations in the next 5 years, which is only a tad more than the entire potential of the distributed commercial solar market. Now, I could not end this portion of the webinar today without addressing corporate offtake agreements. So for a bit of background for anyone in the audience who's less familiar with this, a corporate offtake agreement is basically when a business, usually a very large corporation like Amazon or Google or Target, signs a power purchase agreement with a utility scale wind or solar project. And the market for these contracts has been growing tremendously in recent years. There was 40% growth last year in 2019 over 2018. So corporate offtake agreements obviously remove a company's energy demand from the potential commercial solar market. So it's definitely important that we look at how much demand has been met through those contracts. But since this is sort of outside the scope of the actual solar potential of commercial buildings, we need to just sort of look at it in a different way. So what we've done here is we've compared the annual generation from these corporate offtake projects to the total consumption of commercial buildings in the US. And what we find is that 6% of commercial building demand is being met from corporate offtake projects. And then you have another 2.5% that's being met through commercial solar for a total of nearly 9%. So corporate offtake is clearly a significant part of how companies are choosing to buy renewable energy, and it's growing very fast. You can see from the chart that onshore wind currently accounts for the biggest chunk of this commercial demand, but there's technically more utility scale solar in the corporate offtake pipeline. So we're expecting that dark blue solar chunk is expected to catch up quite quickly. But in general, the addressable market remains quite large for corporate offtake as well as distributed commercial solar. So in closing, I just wanted to let you all know that we're going to be publishing a more detailed report on the results of this study within the coming weeks. So if you're interested in even more data and analysis, including some of these items that are listed here, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And now I'm going to pass the presentation over to Kevin, who is going to show us a little bit more of some of the Station A functionality.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate the background and kind of context and setting the stage here. Give me a second here, and I'm going to broadcast my screen. Great. So you all should see at least my screen now. So I can give you a quick background. So my name's Kevin Berkmeyer. I'm CEO and co-founder of Station A. I've spent my whole career in the space working in retail electricity, developing solar projects with First Solar, also working in stationary energy storage at ARPA-E and Tesla. So thanks to Michelle, Ravi, the WoodMac team for partnering with Station A to produce this study. We see this, I think much like Ravi kind of indicated in the intro, as kind of a real first, for the industry, in the sense of being the first real assessment, of the solar addressable market built from the ground up. we're excited to share those results. So instead of looking at aggregate state-by-state reports, we've gone building by building across over 1 million structures in the United States. And you can dive into that information by creating a Station A account today as well. So I'll start with a little bit of background about Station A, and then dive in more deeply. But at our core, Station A helps power buildings with 100% clean energy. So we're a clean energy marketplace and a platform that evaluates available clean energy solutions, including solar, storage, and other things for buildings, enabling data-driven decisions, and also enabling people to source offers from our provider network. So our users are quite extensive, include providers of solutions. So within that bucket, fairly broad, but developers, capital providers, ESCOs, utilities, reps, technology providers, et cetera, and buyers too, increasingly. So big real estate portfolios and building owners that are coming to us to evaluate their properties for different clean energy options. So today I'll show you how anyone can use Station A to explore the addressable market that Michelle just talked through and that Mac is presenting by assessing buildings, assessing whole markets, and more recently, or as of recently, requesting market quotes too. So you can all do everything I'm about to show you, and this gives you, this should give you, that hands-on view to that kind of bottoms-up analysis that helped inform this addressable market assessment. So we can just simply start. This is our website, stationa.com, by clicking Get Started. And since I, at least based on Michelle's presentation, indicated some potential opportunity in Arizona, we can kind of just quickly get started by typing in target in Phoenix, Arizona. Clicking Next. And kind of immediately getting at least a view into the potential solar system size for this target location in Arizona, in the Phoenix area. And then with the option to kind of explore further. So to dive in deeper, this kind of takes you to this login page where if you already have an account, you can log in, or you can create an account if you don't already have one. I obviously have an account, so I'll log in here quickly. You'll arrive then at this dashboard to our web applications. This includes like product updates, tutorials, subscription status, et cetera. Anyone can do this. Right now we offer free 7-day trial and then an option upgrade to a subscription. But let's really dive in here and start by exploring the addressable market for solar by map through what we call the Explore mode. So here you can see a map in the United States. All those yellow dots represent substations. And let's say I'm a developer and I want to explore Arizona because, as I mentioned before, that's a market where I see a lot of untapped opportunity based on what Michelle just shared. I also know that Michelle is from the Phoenix area, so this might make it a little bit more personal for Michelle. But I can continue to zoom in here and see additional layers of data that start to pop up that we've indexed. So you get a little bit more clarity around those substations, those yellow dots. Start to see transmission lines, locality outlines, those purple areas. And then in some cases, zooming in further, you start to see actual circuit data. As we zoom in though, you'll still start to also see building footprints. So you need to evaluate footprints. Zooming in even further, you'll start to see land parcels, so these yellow outlined areas. Now, you can also start to adjust the base layer visualization mode. So I can color code buildings by solar potential, for example. I can even ground truth things and change that base layer to a slight base layer. I guess in many respects, it enables you to do what Michelle just recommended. It's not word safe, but to basically fly over as look at buildings and see that 70% of these locations or these buildings provide economically viable solar to that owner or tenant. So I'm just going to go back to these kind of default modes for the sake of the example here. And what you can do is kind of around this map. So you can zoom around the map, and I'm going to attempt to find that target location that I entered in originally, and I think this is it. Yes, looks like it's it. And I can click on buildings. So you can simply click on buildings, start to understand all the relevant information about a location. That kind of informs this bottoms-up analysis that Michelle went through and that we talked about. And to really dive see whether or not this specific building is a good candidate for. So what you see is this card, the set build is what the savings would be for solar storage and other solutions. And then you can dive into more detail. So this Quotes tab provides a view into system size, and that system is sized on roof area, at metering limits. This should support to 520 kilowatts of solar. It also accounts for obstruction on that roof. And we model what we call break-even solar PA. So really the minimum PA to achieve positive developer economics to then arrive at that savings relative to their current electricity bill that we estimate. So diving into further detail, or at least what forms the quotes, is locational data and information that we pull from various different sources and synthesize, vetting through area, total floor area, number of stories, height, as you can see here, parcel number, who owns that specific location, other geographic information. We then use what we know about the building, the industry type of that location to estimate electricity usage. You can see here an aggregate from a usage and peak standpoint, but then also disaggregated across cooling, heating, lighting, and equipment. And again, providing a disaggregated view, but by month, as you can see here below. We then take what we could know about that building and some load, and we estimate the cost of electricity, given what we would consider the most likely tariff for that specific building, and show kind of a snapshot into all the kind of potential tariffs that could correspond with that location and the likelihood that they would, with a link to that tariff. So the Salt River Project E36 general tariffs, available incentive programs in case we not identified any available incentive programs for the specific area. We continue to add it. The substation that corresponds with that location and utility territory. So we have all of this detail and this level of information for about 1 million buildings, really a total addressable market that Michelle had mentioned before. That's kind of what helped inform this addressable solar market analysis. We can also, just to show you kind of the scope and geographic competence that we have here, we can also search for an individual address. So let's say I was at Walmart, Massachusetts, just for the sake of the example. Click on that location, fly to that specific location, and there you go. You see Walmart in Lunenburg, Mass. What's interesting about this specific example is it does in fact have solar. So we are starting to detect, we built algorithms, image processing algorithms that automatically detect pre-existing solar. And so you can see here, we're detecting solar with 98% confidence. That's obviously right. And then we continue to show a view into all those other kind of attributes that we had shown previously. Now we continue to add an insight to our places on a regular cadence, including adding real live market quotes from capital bids at the start, so you can access this request quote here. This feature is in beta at the moment, but we're expanding upon this feature to include other providers as well. To really provide people the ability to not just find projects, but also start to connect with the providers of solutions that would be able to serve that project. Now, it's because we built this bottom-up view that we're also able to empower users, like we've done with Luna, to do top-down exploration of any market's potential. So we can enable this top-down exploration through our analyze mode here. What's interesting, about this is this basically enables you to take that map of unit states that I showed you and carve it up in your criteria to really drill down to assess markets and projects. So this mode enables you to do two things. One is build a list of target solar projects based on criteria that I might have to do a solar project. Some of the lists here, like top New Jersey TREC solar candidates, SGIP priority population, fire threat districts, Home Depot, top Massachusetts solar candidates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go ahead quickly to just create a new list here of, I'm actually going to mimic what I had previously created here, but of the solar addressable market, and set criteria quickly, location, United States, And we can dive deeper from here, but just kind of pause there. And what you see here is a list view of all of those locations in the United States. So 862,000. So as you can see, this actually very closely matches that total addressable market that Michelle had communicated. And these buildings can be explored and paged through as much as somebody would like. But we can also adjust these column names to also include solar potential, owner, et cetera. Let's just stop here though, and enable at least the sorting of these locations, the solar potential, and then also just to see, what those aggregates are. So the average system size is around 145 kilowatts across 850 plus thousand buildings. Total sum of the solar potential, that's technical solar potential, 211 gigawatts. But we can go down further now from here. So let's say we want to go back to our example, Arizona. So we can take this by, we can say that, and now you can see 19,000 locations in Arizona. Let's say we want to go even further, and we want to look at only products that are greater than 5. Oops, sorry, we'll W. Click 1,900 now. Now let's introduce maybe a business first. So let's say we want to look at the target buildings more specifically. And so now we're at 30 target buildings that would support at least 500 kilowatts of solar on their roof, with a view into the solar potential, those aggregates as well, up top, and then the ability to click on these specific locations. Again, one that has solar. See the target, at least ownership information here, as well as all of that other detail that I had shown you previously. Now, the other way that you can kind of assess markets is in back analyze mode, input list addresses. So here you can upload a list of addresses, match those addresses throughout places, build a list that you can more easily assess to find projects for a given portfolio or given market, if you will. So a good example of this is recently took a list of addresses for about 3,000 parts across the country, match those to our places, and help the user discover which are the best candidates for solar. And that essentially 2,500. So similar to what Michelle kind of communicated, around 85% of those 3,000 watts would have some positive savings deploying solar, and they would save around $200 million per year with solar and solar plus battery. So we definitely, I think, started to enable to have a more bottoms-up view into what the real opportunity is. Solar for storage for some of these other things. That really enables people to more efficiently, identify these opportunities, go at that addressable market. So we're shining light on that market opportunity for commercial solar. Now, in addition, I'm just going to go back to the website here quickly. In addition to adding more data to our pieces, expand our coverage, we're starting to embed this data and insight to our users' workflow directly in websites to engage with buyers. So what's kind of interesting is we are starting to embed this same view to that market CRMs internally, but also into kind of portals. And we're doing that with some of the largest utilities ESCOs in the U.S. And so you can kind of get a view into what this looks like by to our website and getting started here. Entering an address, this is what we station at K, but you can try this out yourself and enter in any address to explore the potential for clean energy options. I hope you now have a visit, how we work to how we with WoodMac to calculate the true addressable solar market really for the first time, as well as how our users leverage Station A to go at this market. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in this webinar. Also email us at info.station.com. Definitely encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter. We're active making a lot of changes. That's where we share those updates, data enhancements, and features. I appreciate the time in walking through Station A, but also appreciate appreciate collaboration with WoodMac to really enable for the first time with a true view into what solar dates. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin and Michelle. Now we are in the question and answer session of the webinar. As I see, there are at least a dozen or so questions that are already in the Q&A module, so we encourage all of you who are listening in to please submit your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So, Michelle, I'm going to start with you first. You showed the market size in terms of the taking of the on-site projects, right? So can you explain when you say on-site projects, if they also include ground mount, or are you only looking at rooftop?
Yeah, that's a good question, Robbie. We definitely wanted to take into account those ground mount projects. So that on-site solar penetration does include ground mount projects. This would be parking canopies or projects that are sort of like next to a building, anything like that. That's included in that on-site commercial solar penetration figure. The data that we collect on the Wood Mackenzie side of things includes all commercial solar projects, and then we made some of those adjustments that I spoke about earlier in the presentation to sort of distinguish an off-site project that might be like a bigger one, like a community solar project that's not necessarily associated with a commercial customer site, but it's clearly serving commercial customer demand. So I think that answers the question.
Awesome. And Kevin, over to you. You know, when you are looking at these different vector maps, how are you accounting for any of these ground mounts or solar canopy type of projects when you're looking at the solar potential as you just showed on your platform?
Yeah, so good question. So we are primarily accounting for the rooftop solar potential. So the constraints that we use to size that solar potential are roof area, obstruction, and then load. So for example, a building is not a net exporter of that energy. So we have, at least to date, kind of intentionally focused on kind of a rooftop application. That being said, if you saw kind of in the information and data that we collect about locations, we do calculate not just the size and shape of the roof, but also the size and shape of the land parcel, in addition, obviously, to the load. And so what we do imagine kind of expanding into is not just providing a view into the solar potential for that rooftop or constrained by that rooftop size, but also, sizing systems, for any sort of available space from a ground mount perspective. On the carport side, you saw a little bit of a view into some of the image processing algorithms that we've built in terms of identifying whether or not a rooftop has solar. We are starting to collect annotated data, largely from our users, around whether or not buildings have parking structures or parking lots adjacent to buildings. We're starting to use that to train algorithm. That's similar set of algorithms to identify size and shape of a parking lot. So then in an automated manner, we could identify not just the roof and whether or not there's solar there, but we could also identify the size of the parking lot and therefore size a carport system, in addition to identifying the available land space for, say, a ground mounted system. So hopefully that answers that question.
Awesome. No, it does. Michelle, can you stick? Yeah, go ahead, please.
I did just want to comment too, kind of building off of what Kevin was just saying. One reason we wanted to present our results, both in terms of the capacity of the solar potential of commercial rooftops, but also in terms of the number of commercial buildings, is that even if a lot of those buildings end up being better sites for like a canopy or a ground mount, what this sort of the data behind all this research also accounts for just the number of customers that could be tapped for actually installing commercial solar, or could be community solar subscribers, that type of thing. So we definitely wanted to look at it in both of those ways.
Got it. And that leads me to a question that's been asked by an audience member is, can we sort of explain how the total addressable market, the waterfall chart that you have on the screen right now, is the same on slides 13 and 14, or in other words, we get the same final outcome, whether we are looking at it in terms of capacity or in terms of sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So these two slides are just slightly different, but in other words, the total addressable market in terms of capacity is, so this slide here, it's taking out all of those solar projects that we know are serving commercial solar customers, and then taking all of those remaining rooftops that we know don't have any actual solar installed, or customers that are already accounted for because they're subscribers to like a remotely net metered project or a community solar project, and it's taking the capacity potential of all of those remaining sites. So there are some slight differences between these two charts, but that's why it's sort of the same addressable market.
Makes sense. And then that sort of says to the conservative nature of the analysis, right? And I think you've explicitly mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation that this analysis is inherently conservative. So if you sort of step back and think in terms of what are some of the assumptions that we could relax that would effectively increase that addressable market size, what do you think would be the three most important assumptions that we could consider relaxing in order to get to a more aggressive view of the market?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just from my own sort of personal viewpoint, the higher power density of modules today is really becoming a more compelling use case for commercial solar customers. I think quite quickly the technology is evolving and the cost of modules is coming down rapidly. I think the pandemic has actually caused module pricing to come down a lot more than folks were expecting because of a little bit of easing up on actual demand. So I think if you were to loosen any of the assumptions around this study, assuming that you can just straight up get more capacity from these rooftops because higher quality, higher power density modules are going to be cheaper, is probably a relatively safe thing to assume going forward.
And Kevin, again, you also published a solar potential in terms of kilowatts, right, on a specific rooftop. Are there any assumptions that go into that model which you think could be relaxed a bit if you were to get a slightly more aggressive view of the market?
Yeah, so we similarly as Michelle kind of indicated, that power density, piece is an assumption. So, assuming that 14 watts, per square foot. We also, make assumptions around obstruction, and that are fairly, conservative, as well as for, the typical setbacks in like an installation, or accounting for the typical setbacks in an installation. So, the approach we take is to be conservative. Now, I'd say the other point, more broadly is, the denominator is actually larger than we're communicating it. So, we have comprehensive coverage. We don't have 100%, of every building mapped, an index that's over 10,000 square feet. So, we probably, based on our estimates, we have, over 2/3, of all buildings, mapped in the United States. And in that number is increasing, kind of on a daily basis. So, so the other way to really, I'd say, get like a more expansive, more more granular view, like into the kind of true addressable market is, increasing, that denominator, and accounting for, every building, and that's an ongoing basis.
Got it. And if you were to sort of reverse the question, right? So again, clearly acknowledging that this is a conservative view of the market, but are there any additional downsides or new downsides that could limit the total addressable market, whether they're from a policy standpoint or financing or just the nature of the business? I know in Addressable there are a few, but Michelle, do you take a stab at it?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab. So one thing that we've noticed on our team when we're looking at sort of which markets are doing, growing or that we're forecasting a lot of growth in the commercial solar segment is that things like interconnection processes and costs can matter a lot. So one example that I'm sure lots of folks on the audience are aware of is that in Massachusetts, there's a lot of ongoing proceedings and such at the state level for interconnecting projects in the Massachusetts SMART program. And the utilities there have released studies that interconnection costs for some of these projects could be as much as $1 a watt, which is insane when you think about the sort of cost of a commercial solar system being anywhere between $2 and $3 a watt, depending on the market. So if anything like that is going on in a state market, that's certainly going to limit the total addressable market and make a lot of projects just no longer economically viable. On the other hand, if you have any sort of incentive program or like right now in New Jersey, they're sort of transitioning into a new incentive program for sort of the next evolution of what was their SREC program. Because of the fairly lucrative incentives that projects can earn, a lot of developers are pretty excited about what can happen in New Jersey within the coming several years. And, any kind of incentive is just going to make a lot more projects a lot more viable. It just makes things easier. It reduces friction on transaction costs. It allows more headroom on actual margins for certain projects. It entices more customers because there's going to be heftier savings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of a couple examples of how that addressable market could move either up or down depending on what's going on in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I might add just like another lens to that too. I think what's interesting, there's obviously the constraints associated with policy and interconnection, but I think what's often overlooked, the constraints associated with scalability, right? So the typical development process and origination processes have really not changed, right? So you still deal with fragmented data, software workflows, the origination development process taking 6 to 9 months, the data collection, process being quite difficult. You also have just non-standard roles and non-standard projects. Every project is a one-off in many respects. You have like a lack of specialization, generally speaking. It's like hardware sellers are also developing and installing. The sellers of solutions, kind of play the role of advisor too. So, that's kind of an interesting dynamic. And I think the third one that we've run into a lot is just unequal access to data and insight. So, not a lot of transparency, for buyers to understand necessarily, what's best for them. Not necessarily a dedicated energy team to like evaluate, like a project efficiently on the buyer side, and then not all sellers can access buyers, at scale. So, I think there's not just there's the whole set of policy constraints, but there's a number of other interesting, like kind of process-oriented, development-oriented constraints that really need to be mitigated in order for the market to start to grow exponentially.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, Kevin. One other thing I might say, sort of going off of my prior response, is that obviously when you have like an incentive program or something like that, that can really open up a commercial solar market. But I will say what I think is kind of revealing about these results is that just looking at the total cost of electricity that these commercial customers are paying, we have this really enormous addressable market potential. So to me, as somebody who's like really looked at this industry for quite some time, some of those other hurdles that Kevin Kevin was referencing, they're obviously the main focus and the main challenge when we're thinking about tapping into this commercial solar market. But there are lots of available sites, and there is an addressable market that is quite large.
Yeah, good point there, right? And to sort of reiterate, whatever we have shown so far is sort of the addressable market snapshot in like July of 2020, as in today, right? A lot of the assumptions that can start to change once we move into the next few years, where arguably solar costs are going to change, which impacts your LCOE, your electricity rates are obviously also evolving on a regular basis, as well as the whole innovation on the technology side, where if for instance shading was an issue for a system based on module power rating of 250 or 300, it may not be an issue once you move to a 500 or 500 plus watt panel, which can obviously fit into a much smaller footprint, right? So I agree with you that a lot of us, a lot of the nuances in terms of how do we look at this market size, whether it's on the conservative side or aggressive, or how can we exponentially increase the market size, which is one of the questions from the audience members, is there are a lot of parameters that are changing on the technology, policy, financing side of things. Anyway, we have about 5 to 8 more minutes, so I'm going to quickly jump on to a few more questions. Kevin, a question for you. Do the savings, as you pointed out on the platform, include the cost of annual PPA payments, and how does Station A obtain that energy or demand data for those sites?
Yeah, so let me talk to the usage information quickly. So we model and simulate to effectively predict the electricity usage for each of those million buildings, and so we do that based on the size and shape of the building, the weather and climate data, in the industry type that we've identified or mapped that building to, and we effectively run a building energy thermal model to output that, as you can see in the demo I showed you, the annual and monthly electricity output estimates, and that is informed by all the attributes I just mentioned. So all the attributes that we assess, on a building. So, quite building specific, I'd say conservative in many cases. And then we also benchmark that currently with actual load. So we do actually have a lot of actual load data from our users, and we increasingly, add to that repository of actual load data, and using that to, benchmark currently, but we will start to use that to learn from and to improve those energy models to provide a more accurate assessment. But the intention is really to provide an indicative view, into the economics, for a specific project. The savings estimate is, essentially, the avoided cost, or it's the savings associated with paying for electricity at that PPA price relative to the estimated bill cost that we've calculated. And so that's supposed to be a kind of an up to number. It's, as I mentioned before, that PPA price that we model is a break-even PPA. It's kind of the lowest PPA you would potentially achieve. So therefore, it's kind of an up to savings amount, X savings amount that we're reflecting there for any building. We continue to, I'd say, not just improve those load models, but improve and update all of the kind of system costs and everything else that goes into that PPA model based on industry feedback. But happy to dive into further detail there, offline if somebody's interested. But hopefully that answers the question.
Cool. Given there are a couple of confirmations, I believe I saw that in the platform, but just for sake of the audience members, I believe I did see that there is some information on the ownership of some of these buildings. So in other words, do we have any insights on leased versus directly owned building sites? That's one. And secondly, the second question I believe was around also, do you have data on buildings that already have solar installations?
Yeah, so on the first question, ownership, yes, we do have ownership information. We pull ownership data from tax and county assessor records, and that's from parcel data. So we have about 145 million land parcels indexed. Mostly every land parcel in the United States. If that ownership information is available through that tax and county assessor record, we have it. On the Robbie, can you just remind me of the second question quickly?
Yeah, second question was, do we have data on which of those buildings already have solar installations?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. So that's an interesting question. That in the demo I had shared, or at least shown, where we are automatically identifying solar, with some percentage confidence. So that is that image processing algorithm that I mentioned before. So just based on a satellite image, and the pattern associated with panels on a rooftop, we're identifying whether or not rooftops have solar. We do that across every single one of our buildings. We haven't run that at scale quite yet across all of our buildings, but that is something that we can do and that we will be doing shortly. And that would effectively provide another view into the bottoms up, analysis around whether or not a building does have solar. And so we see interesting applications of that in markets where there's high solar penetration. Obviously in the markets with low solar penetration, it's not that exciting to, filter out the ones that have solar or do not have solar. But in states like California and New Jersey, the top five that, Michelle had kind of called out, running that algorithm across those markets would enable us to separate out, the roofs that have solar from the ones that do not have solar.
Got it. Folks, we have time for one final question, so thanks for everyone who stayed with us for this hour. But to wrap it up, the final question we have is, what is the estimated demand in terawatt hours of these facilities versus their solar PV carrying capacity?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. I wanted to address this quickly for the audience member who asked it. This final slide that I presented, this sort of shows the penetration of not just commercial solar, but also corporate offtake. This is a good, if you want to look at the consumption of these buildings as opposed to the rooftop solar potential of these buildings, this slide and this data sort of gets at that. So nearly 1 million sort of terawatt hours of potential consumption there.
Kevin, any final thoughts on how does Station A account for sort of the energy demand for all the building sites that you covered?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that kind of building by building analysis around electricity demand, specific to each building. And so, the aggregate or the aggregation of those load curves is effectively, that aggregated total electricity demand. For anyone who has further questions on that, I'm happy to dive in deeper, offline, and kind of share or show, more specifically what I'm talking about. But based on the fact that we can do this on a bottoms up perspective, or from a bottoms up building by building perspective, and we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we aggregate that information, whether by geography or utility territory or industry type, things like that, that enables, I think, anyone to get like a very detailed view into, the specific opportunity, whether that's a whole market or, a single building.
Right.
Awesome. That brings us to the end of today's webinar, folks. Again, thanks to our partners at Station A for making this discussion possible. And again, to reiterate what Michelle said in the presentation, that we'd be embarking on writing a detailed report, which would be more granular in terms of market sizing by state. So for those of our clients, keep an eye on that in the coming weeks. The presentation will be available on demand replay for 3 months on the GTM website, so please share with your colleagues or feel free to rewatch it at any time. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next GTM webinar.